Welcome to FSMA Compliance for Feed Mills, a resource for small to medium-sized livestock feed mills in the state of Kansas to help them comply with the Preventive Controls for Animal Food rule. This presentation is focused on answering, how can I control hazards? As we previously described, hazards may be known or reasonably foreseeable, or may rise to the level where they require a preventive control. Regardless of the type of hazard, control is necessary. The type of control and its respective documentation vary based on the severity and probability of the hazard's occurrence. If the hazard is known or reasonably foreseeable, but either does not have the severity or probability that it requires a preventive control, it still must be controlled in a way that is both observable or documented. For example, a hazard may occur in this sector is metal in feed mills in Kansas. Typically, Kansas feed mills control for metal by having grates over the receiving pit, having receiving that is visually observed so that if there are pieces of metal that can be seen and removed during unloading, and there are magnets located before the hammer mill, before the pellet mill, and in the finished feed leg that are checked weekly, and there's documentation or evidence that this weekly check occurs. There's also typically a preventive maintenance program for metal equipment within the facility and documentation and evidence that this plan is being followed. Another example of a way we may control hazards through a prerequisite program may be for the control of aflatoxin. In Kansas, there are some years with a high probability and some years of a low probability of aflatoxin occurrence in grains based on growing conditions that year. If it is a year with a low probability of aflatoxin, we may not have a preventive control implemented, but we still need to make sure that our product is safe. In this case, we do so through a prerequisite program. This may list the ingredients that are susceptible to mycotoxins, such as corn and wheat, and ensure that they are only received from approved suppliers and that there is an approved supplier list that is up to date to support this. Maybe there's a mycotoxin management program that is written with sufficient detail regarding the frequency and method of sampling grains and testing for mycotoxins, and there's documentation and evidence that this program is being followed. Again, receiving is typically being visually observed. We can sometimes get a visual indication of mycotoxins if grains are black, green, or moldy. However, not all molds are mycotoxins, and not all mycotoxins can be visually observed, so this should not be the only prevention step. Finally, individuals receiving grains should know what to do if there's evidence of elevated aflatoxin levels in ingredients or finished feed. At what point should they reject the load? When should they notify a supervisor? And what needs to be documented? From time to time, known or reasonably foreseeable hazards are so severe or probable that they require a preventive control. In this case, a preventive control must be implemented that requires a whole nother level of detail and documentation. For example, if a facility is manufacturing pet food instead of livestock feed and has determined that metal detection is necessary of their finished product, the metal detector may be an example of a process preventive control. In this case, all finished bags of pet food are run through a metal detector before being cleared for distribution. There are written management components with documentation and evidence that this process is followed. The metal detector is monitored and an exception record is generated whenever metal is detected, and there are 2 years of these exception records available. There are corrective actions planned and carried out to identify the source of metal and eliminate or reduce its likelihood of occurrence. The metal contamination is either removed from the product or the product itself is diverted and disposed of, and the food safety plan, if necessary, is reanalyzed. There is evidence that validation of the metal detector has occurred and that the metal detector itself is capable of detecting the size and type of metal within the parameter value identified. And finally, there is verification of the metal detector's implementation and effectiveness. There are records that monitoring and corrective action records are reviewed within 7 days. There are hourly checks that the metal detector is working by use of a test rod. And there's an annual external calibration of the metal detector with records to document its occurrence. When we are considering hazards and their control, we must assume that if it isn't written down, You cannot prove that it happened. Documentation of these controls is key. An inspection by the Kansas Department of Agriculture, or FDA, of a facility's compliance with the Preventive Controls for Animal Food Rule will evaluate the facility's food safety plan and extensively evaluate accompanying records. To help with this process, the Kansas Department of Agriculture has developed a variety of example prerequisite programs and an example preventive control program that may be of use by facilities here in Kansas. There are example prerequisite programs for the control of aflatoxin, metal, and drug carryover, as well as a preventive control program example to control for aflatoxin, so that facilities can see the thoroughness necessary for prerequisite or preventive control programs based on the severity and probability of different hazards in different types of facilities. Again, these are only examples, and each facility is expected to make appropriate determinations for hazard identification, hazard analysis, and control of hazards, but we hope that these resources can be helpful. This project is supported by the Food and Drug Administration of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services as part of a financial assistance award with 100% funded by FDA HHS. The contents are those of the authors and do not necessarily represent the official views of, nor an endorsement by, FDA HHS or the U.S. government. If you have additional questions regarding the Food Safety Modernization Act or the Preventive Controls for Animal Food Rule, please reach out to us at the Kansas Department of Agriculture in the Dairy and Feed Safety Program. You may reach us by email at kda.feed@ks.gov or by phone at 785-564-6700.